The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from July 28, 2020. Author Alaya Dawn Johnson joins us from Mexico City. Members Christina Britton Conroy and Susan Wands engage her in a wide-ranging discussion on the moral questions of race and passing, literary fiction and how genre fiction can cross over, obstacles to writing in your second language, and much more. A fascinating conversation for readers and writers alike. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website, listed in the description. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Wands, and I'm here with the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society. We're going to be interviewing Alaya Dawn Johnson tonight, the author of Trouble the Saints. Everybody's mute right now, but as things go along during question and answer and during our interviewers and such, we'll unmute you. We'll have a question and answer at the end. So if questions occur to you during the course of this, go ahead and just type them out in the chat window, and I'll copy them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can during the course of the evening. So first of all, I want to thank you for coming. This is our very first Zoom session for our Storytelling as Advocacy session. It's going to be a series outside of our regular monthly meetings. We realized that maybe we would like to have a program to uplift and elevate Black, Indigenous, people of color authors. And so we were lucky enough to find Alaya's work and invite her to Zoom with us from Mexico City. This title came about because we've been working with a very gifted young person, Selena Newton from Pace University. And so she brainstormed with us and we came up with the title with her. I'm going to introduce her to you, and she can tell you more about how this title came about. Go ahead, Selena.
Hi. As Susan mentioned, yes, I am Selena, and I am currently a senior at Pace University. I got involved with the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society as part of a school service requirement, but because I've enjoyed it so much, I've decided to just continue working with everyone. So in collaboration with Susan, I came up with the title Storytelling as Advocacy because I wanted to define the act of storytelling as a way to create empathy and translate our emotions, which are very powerful human motivators. So storytelling is one of the most powerful tools that we have that can affect change in our society. So good storytelling is able to promote change and action today.
Thank you, Selena. She's also written some really wonderful language for us to use in terms of trying to craft language about how do we have inclusion, how do we find other authors' work. So now we are going to start our interview with Alaya. She's being interviewed by our member, Christina Britton Conroy. She is the author of the award-winning historical series novels under the umbrella title His Majesty's Theater. They're fabulous. I highly recommend them. And now I'm going to make sure that Alaya and Christina are unmuted, so take it away.
Okay, hi Alaya and everybody else.
Hi Christina, hi everyone.
Good to see you and hear you. Okay, yes. Well, this is a treat for the Historical Novel Society because this book it's historical fiction, but it's also fantasy and horror and wonderful, exciting storytelling. So this is a very cool book. Anyway, so briefly, Alaya is a very interesting young lady with an amazing background. She was born in Washington, D.C., and her family has been there for many generations. And very interestingly, her grandfather was of the first generation of African Americans ever to work in for the American government. I mean, it's kind of, when I read that, it was kind of horrible that it wasn't until 1930s. But, you know, that your grandfather was one of the first is kind of remarkable. So Alaya went to Columbia, where she majored in East Asian languages and culture. Maybe we'll find out how many languages she speaks. I only speak one foreign language, so that's like amazing. Okay, while studying abroad in Japan, she hitchhiked through the southern islands and ended up in Naha, Okinawa. And there she was inspired to write her first published fantasy short story called Shard of Glass. Isn't that a scary title? Okay, now her very first novel, Racing the Dark, was published in 2007 by Agate Books. And then she sold a pair of urban fantasy novels set in the Roaring Twenties, and we were hearing some of that music just now. That was fun, Susan. Roaring Twenties in New York City, and that was sold to a major publishing house. And after that, she decided she could dedicate herself to writing full time, which is what we all really want to do. Okay, now among her many book awards, and go on her, her website or her publishers, because the awards go on and on and on and on and on. But her YA novel, The Summer Prince, was longlisted for the National Book Award. Hello, very nice. Congratulations on that one. So another one, Love is a Drug, won the prestigious Nebula Award for YA science fiction and fantasy, and her many other award-winning short stories have appeared in magazines and anthologies, including the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy of 2015. Now, she lives in Mexico City. And I want to hear about Mexico City right now, because I sang there with the opera 100 years ago, and I really didn't like it at all. Obviously, you love it. So that's really interesting. She recently received her master's degree in Mesoamerican Studies from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. And her thesis, get this, ladies and gentlemen, explores fermented food and its ritual symbolism in pre-conquest Mexico. Interesting stuff. She's also, a singer and composer and lyricist, as if that wasn't enough. And her band, she's got beautiful things on YouTube, great band, fabulous musicians, called Cananea. And so, Alaya, talk to us. Tell us about your amazing book, which is Trouble the Saints. Fascinating, amazing story. So.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. Actually, I moved a month ago from Mexico City to rural Oaxaca. So now I've lived in Mexico City for about 6 years, and now I'm starting a whole new adventure. So Trouble the Saints is a novel that takes place in New York City at the kind of right before the U.S. entrance into World War II. It's kind of a novel of people on the cusp. It stars a woman, Phyllis Green, or LeBlanc, who was born in Harlem and has, for the last 15 years, kind of used her uncanny skills, because she was born with it's historical fiction, but it does have a kind of magical element. And so she was born with a kind of uncanny gift of, in her case, deadly accuracy with her hands. But in general, the gifts are called hands. And she has been, for the last 15 years, passing as white for a Russian mob boss in the village. And she's been supposedly his angel of justice. And so the novel begins in kind of classic noir fashion with her kind of trying to get out of the game, realizing that the choices that seemed so easy when she was 20 are now much harder and harder for her to believe those justifications that she had. And so it's an exploration of race, of power structures, of kind of the choices that you make when you realize you've made all of the wrong choices.
Okay, made all the wrong choices. So really interesting. So what would have been her right choices?
So Phyllis is a very complicated character. I think in her case, she she made a certain choice, right, by passing, and that choice is one I really wanted to explore in a historical context, but with a lot of nuance. There's a kind of long legacy of passing novels in the African American community. The most prominent, famous one is Passing by Nella Larson, and certainly there, but there's also kind of a lot of weird sort of ideas that float around about what passing means. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, it's a general term to refer to people from one ethnic community passing as in general as white, but it's not necessarily white. And it was a very common phenomenon just in the States, especially in that time period, just because of the way, because of the legacy of slavery and discrimination, and the way that kind of worked out in the States. Passing was extremely, it was a viable method for certain members of the Black community to try to make a living and bring that money and stability back to their community. So a lot of people have a kind of notion of passing as just like, you want to abandon your community, and that wasn't really at all the majority of real life examples of people passing. And so I wanted to tell that kind of a story, and kind of explore it in detail. So I mentioned that to say that, what choices did she make, that were wrong? And passing, I wouldn't, I don't think it's my place to really say, like, to people who lived in that time period, you shouldn't have done that. But it's a very morally complicated choice. And Phyllis makes it more morally complicated, right? Because she's using it in order to use these powers that she was gifted with for an end that's very violent, and at the end of the day is really personally benefiting her instead of benefiting her community. And so those choices that she makes of killing, of believing this mob boss when he says that everyone she's killing is like a bad guy and she doesn't need to worry about it, all of those are the choices that are kind of catching up to her. And I will say, I do think that especially the way that she uses passing, the way it's often used, and this comes up also in Nella Larson's Passing, that it's a kind of violence. It's a way of using a very violent power structure for one's personal gain. And so, like I said, it's a little hard for me to personally judge, because I, especially on my mom's side of the family, there's a wide range of kind of a rainbow of skin tones, but some people on my grandmother's side of the family absolutely would have been in the position of Phyllis, my main character, able to go between those communities. And it was a dangerous thing to do, of course, also that. So that was, I would say, was probably the first choice that she made that led to the other choices. And now she's kind of stuck, and trying to figure out a way out.
Yeah, but like you say, really, really tough choices considering her options, which were limited.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that you have it set during World War II. I mean, I happen to love the music. I love the what was going on, the lack of technology, which you use with the fantasy, all the magical powers that people have. With the lack of technology, I personally enjoyed that a lot. Did that come into thinking why you said it at that time?
No, I mean, I wasn't thinking so much about the technological aspects, although certainly I personally love historical fiction set in that time period. So perhaps that was part of what kind of led me to think about it as a possibility. I think probably the kind of strongest motivator for me setting it in that particular time period is it's kind of, I don't know how to say this, kind of like a place, an intermediate place sort of in my own family history, in my understanding of, and also in my own family history, and also in kind of a general history of the Black experience in the States, which is to say that my grandfather, the one who was one of the very first employees Black employees in the U.S. government, was born in 1899. So I am from, basically my parents had children late. He had hit my mother late. And so I ended up, with a grandfather who was born in 1899, and his parents were alive during the Civil War. Now, I don't know if any of them were enslaved. I don't think so, but it's certainly possible that his grandparents were. And to me, the fact that that time period is very much something that he was living through, that he experienced both the kind of connection to slavery as well as, being my grandfather, who I knew growing up, and my own connection in this very modern, supposedly very far apart age of 2020. And so I liked it because it seemed to me to kind of put a pin in the middle of what is supposedly distant history and explore how it isn't. One of the characters, Tamara, is from rural Virginia. I actually set where she is from is the town where my other side of the family, my dad's side of the family, my dad grew up in this small town. It's a small segregated town in Virginia. And she basically is explicitly stated in the book that she is the granddaughter of a former slave. So that particular gap is very much, it's not a gap, basically, is what I'm trying to say, that the ancestors are present. And so that's another thing too, because the presence of the ancestors is coming in. So all of that kind of that was why I felt this it felt very right to set it there, because it was right exactly the way I wanted to try to explore was, what I wanted to explore was intergenerational trauma and the effects of violence, structural violence, on the Black community, in terms of how it affects us even when we don't know exactly the stories that came before, even when they're not actually telling us all that happened before, how that impacts people. It's a lot of, frankly, it's a lot of people with PTSD that they've never really dealt with it, and it's generational. And that was really the reason why it seemed to me like to be a good moment to try to look back and also make it clear to the reader that you should be looking forward, because a lot of the issues that Phyllis is dealing with aren't in any way over with at all. I mean, passing isn't necessarily as much of an issue now, but it's not over with either. I mean, just for example, not many people know that Mariah Carey is Black. A lot of people are still kind of treading that color line in a way, and so to me, that was really why I wanted to set it there. And the kind of the romance of it and the technological, certainly when I was writing those sections towards the end where the war is, Pearl Harbor has happened and the war has begun, or the U.S. has entered the war, and they're kind of sending back the kind of redacted letters, that to me was certainly very,
that's very moving.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed writing that, because it's very different. Now you just have so much more immediate communication, and so from a dramatic perspective, it's certainly powerful.
Yeah, all that, that lack of communication. And now, am I remembering your hero there? He was drafted. That's right. He didn't enlist.
No.
He got his letter, and then he didn't tell her, and finally he had to go with of course, segregated troops in those days too. So all that layer on layer on layer on layer, and of course, I mean, as you say, it's a never-ending saga. And since you wrote the book, while it was, I guess, getting edited and published, all this new stuff has blown up in the world.
Yeah.
So, very, very timely. How, so I'm just curious, as now thinking of you as an author selling the book, I imagine you've got all kinds of cool hooks for PR. And
I mean, it's very odd, I have to say. Listen, I mean, these issues, the issues that we are seeing explode in such a dramatic and unmistakable way would not be exploding in such a way if they were not things that have been festering under the surface of American life for decades and centuries. So in one sense, I mean, it was going to happen sometime, you know, and I wrote the book about those issues for the exact same reason that they ended up exploding, because, you know, they're just things that are intertwined with the life of any Black person. I mean, really in the world, because of the legacy even of imperialism, but in my particular case, especially in the United States. So that but I will say it is a little, I don't know. It's kind of like I'm not quite sure what's going on, because also I have that extra layer of not being in the States. So I was in Mexico City. I'm now in rural Mexico, and so there's a lot of very strange kinds of echoes coming back to me of my parents' stories of the civil rights movement in the 60s, and now this is happening. That generation is pretty old now, you know, and so they're really looking back at what they did, and they accomplished so much, but they all, you know, also it wasn't enough, you know, and this is very clear how not enough, and not to say, like, you know, it's their fault that they didn't accomplish enough. I mean, they were pushing a very heavy rock up a really steep hill. I mean, it's not easy in any way.
Right, and it's just you know, ungratifying that what they accomplished either didn't stick, or people who look like me ignored it, you know. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to me that people who look like me now are buying, like, the best-selling books on the New York Times nonfiction. They're all about racial relations right now.
Yeah.
Which is like, hello, you know. I mean, these books have been out there a while. I mean, and they're obviously wonderful new ones too. Do you have a favorite? Do you have or a favorite author, or somebody who's dealing with their PTSD by writing nonfiction?
You know, I haven't read any of that particular new crop of race relation novels. I mean, I will say, like, in terms of, I know her personally, and I think, you know, she has a really great grasp on these issues. That Nikki Kendall's Hood Feminism looks amazing, and I'm super looking forward to reading that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like I said, because again, these books have I think a lot of the books that are on the bestseller list now are really specifically targeted kind of towards white people. Like, they're not so much in-depth explorations of these issues for people who've been, you know, aware of them and focusing on them for their lives, you know. So
people who look like me, that's what I'm thinking.
But I do think it's great that, you know, people are taking, and hopefully, you know, this might kind of portend a kind of more dramatic cultural shift. You know, all sorts of people are taking more notice of these issues and trying to think about things, think about structural racism in more profound ways, you know. And so that to me is heartening, absolutely. But I'm not anywhere near as large a paroxysm of kind of demanding justice, but certainly I've seen a number of these sort of mini upheavals, at least in my kind of field of science fiction and fantasy publishing. And there's often a way that the dial gets moved just a little, you know, and then it kind of slides back, and maybe it slides back a little less than where it was before, but I've certainly learned to kind of temper my expectations, you know, because the first time I went through one of those rounds, I was like, you know, everything is going to be different now, you know, and it wasn't, you know. So I'm kind of hopeful, but I'm also trying not to get ahead of myself.
Yeah. So I'm very curious, because when in university, you studied foreign languages. Mm-hmm. And yet your use of the English language is so beautiful. I mean, I a couple of my favorite lines from the book. You have one here, and it doesn't even matter for you guys who haven't read the book where it comes from, but she writes, "The evening breeze slid down the bare skin of her arms like velvet, holding a lingering warmth from the cheerful spring day already passing." Which is just so beautiful. So for someone who didn't particularly study English, so any idea where, I mean, I obviously you did a lot of reading and a lot of whatever, but you know, how did you, after studying, you know, foreign languages and other cultures, and then you started writing basically very cool fantasy in English.
Mhm. Right. I mean, I always say, I mean, for me personally, I always, people ask me, well, are you going to major in English? And I said, no, because I said, you know, since I was young, really like 10 years old, that I wanted to be a novelist.
Oh.
You can imagine. So when I went to college, you know, are you going to major in English? I said, no, why would I do that? That's ridiculous. Like, I'm here to learn about every other thing I could possibly learn about so I can put it in my novels. That is what is more important to me. So for me, the English was, you know, that was what I did on my own time. And I tried to use or take advantage of my education as best I could to explore, especially other languages. I mean, to me, I don't remember much of Japanese, so please don't try to ask me to say anything. It's been a while. But you know, I studied Japanese for 4 years. I studied French. You know, I got like pretty decent at all of them. But the first language I've ever spoken, I mean, well, I'm just totally fluent in, is Spanish. And that is, and I just feel like every time I learn a language, and especially with my experience with Spanish, that you kind of end up with a certain distance. You end up, especially in my case, as I got my master's degree in Spanish. I mean, it wasn't in Spanish, but I was taking all my classes in Spanish. I was doing all my work in Spanish. So it ended up kind of like clicking something else in my brain, where I started looking at English in a kind of more distant way, not just as the language which I use to express all things. You know, it's an option among other options. And so to understand that, oh, in Spanish you say things this way, and that encompasses like these three definitions that in English are separate, or you know, the opposite, that in English we lump all these things together, but actually in Spanish they're all differentiated in a certain way. And that to me is the root of poetry. It's the root of being able to tease apart language in a way that can create beauty, you know? So that to me has been a huge boon to my writing. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that Trouble the Saints was the novel I finally figured out how to write, because it's a very ambitious novel. I took 7 years to write it. And I started it right before I left New York. So it was my New York City novel. I started it, but I just didn't understand what it was. You know, I didn't quite understand what I was doing. I just knew I wanted to write a story about this hit woman for the mob who's passing. You know, her lover's taken her, or 15 years ago, he tried to save her. This didn't work at all. It backfired about as much as you would expect a too hot-headed savior to work. And kind of they've been living in the aftermath of that for the last, 10 years ago he tried to rescue her, and then they were living in the aftermath of that for 10 years. And then, you know, this new series of revelation comes, and she has to make these really heavy decisions. And I knew I wanted to write that, but the end of what I thought was that novella, you know, I just thought it was like the first section was just the whole story. I just didn't work. I didn't know what to do with it. And so that was when I came to Mexico, was when I suddenly said, oh, you know, what if I just kept going? What if I just wrote the story that is just keeps knocking around in my head, instead of saying, you know, oh, well, a noir story ends here, you know, like I ended it where the story should end, and now there's no more story. And I, you know, why does there have to be no more story? There obviously is a story. Like everybody, you know, it's a silly thing, right? But if you think about it, so much of Western narrative has this notion of, you know, the story ends where the violence ends, you know, where the violence has put a point to something. But that's not really where the story ends. We all have to live in the aftermath and the wreckage of that. I mean, that's like literally the whole legacy of the Black experience in America in a lot of ways, right? Is living in the wreckage of that. And so that was why it all kind of exploded when I had this freedom. And I think in some ways this freedom was not just the physical distance of Mexico, but also this kind of linguistic distance, you know, this kind of this ability, or this sudden understanding that I actually I could do it differently. I could do it differently because I wasn't bound by these rules that, when you're living in them, are kind of invisible. You know, I kind of had to get a little out of New York to write my New York novel.
Yeah, that's so good for all the writers here, because we do like put boundaries on ourselves. And her book, it's really long, but it's all, you know, stuff that's like should be there. And actually, when you were saying that, just another one of my favorite quotes, if you'll bear with me, because this is so cool. She says, and I don't even remember which character says this, sometimes I don't know how we will survive each other. Sometimes the greatest violence you can do to another person is to love them. which is great. Susan, I'm not watching the clock here. Should I be? To go on to a Q&A, or?
We have lots of questions, so I wouldn't mind trying to address some of these, because we have a lot here. People really want to talk to her.
Great.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question that came in from Fanula. Fanula wanted to know, what voices or authors in historical fiction are you most excited about right now? And what roles, tropes, or cliches for Black characters do you think are overdone in historical fiction?
Okay. I feel like kind of when I went into my master's program, I kind of took a long break from reading more historical fiction in English. It was one of those things where I was kind of overwhelmed by having to figure out how to read things in Spanish. And so probably a lot of my references are a little out of date. So that's just like my warning. So, you know, there's it's a little hard, right? I mean, historical fiction is one of those genres that has traditionally been so white, that as a lover of historical fiction, I just sort of put up with some things, you know. For example, like, I'm a huge Georgette Heyer fan, but I mean, this is a deeply problematic love. Like, I can sometimes really get into her novels. I can blitz through them, but then sometimes, you know, I'll just run up against this hard shoal of anti-Semitism that's just like, ugh. Or you know, I mean, it's just she's a complicated writer. And you know, obviously she's a much older example. So I feel like it's a little hard for me, because the ones that I grew up reading were all kind of in the mainstream of historical fiction, which is to say they're all white writers. Like, I loved Judith Merkel Riley growing up, like my favorite writer ever. I loved well, a lot of historical romance, but still, there's a lot of people. There's kind of classic, like Beverly Jenkins, doing historical romance, but there's also kind of a new crop coming up, which, you know, kind of historical fiction and fantasy. There's one called The Year of the Witching, which I'm getting the impression it's kind of historical fantasy. And looks super interesting. I would love to. I want to read that for sure. There's also, you know, there's that movie, which is hilarious, because this is the kind of thing where I wish that people would write more of these. It was called Belle, and I love that. I loved finally being able to see someone I could really relate to in historical fiction. And so I think the thing I most dislike, and it probably could be summed up as the difference between the book Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and the series Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, because in the book, Stephen, the Black butler of Lady Poole, or the Poole family, is very much a main character. If anything, he's the character with the most screen time of anyone in that. He's certainly Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and their conflict is probably the big conflict. But it's very interesting, because really Stephen is the one whose eyes through which you see so much of the action, and he's absolutely 100% complex and interesting, and you see the complexities of his position in that society. And I loved it because, I mean, how many Regency novels have we all read, and there's just like not a single character of color, and that's totally historical. I mean, absolutely ahistorical, right? But that is, to me, what I most dislike about historical fiction, is a sort of totally a historical whitewashing of actual reality. People are like, oh, it's not realistic to like have, you know, PC, but that's actually the absolute opposite of the truth. The truth is that there's a huge amount of diversity in history, and the ahistorical revision is making it all white. But the TV show absolutely it changed the emphasis. So that Stephen was just sort of this side character who was caught up in bigger events, but the big characters were the white men. And it frustrated me so much because it made me understand the mistake that Susanna Clarke had made, which was that Stephen, though he was a very strong character in his own right, was not in a community of other people. You never saw his interactions with other Black characters. You never saw his interactions with other people who would have understood him in his context. And so because of that, he never really spoke to anyone about what his whole kind of very complex internal life, which meant that at the moment of putting on the screen, it was easy for those writers to say, oh, let me just shift this a little. And they managed to maintain most of like the story beats. They didn't cut him out of the story, but they absolutely stripped him of all of that agency and rich kind of personal, that kind of personal complexity, you know, and he just became exactly what you would expect that kind of character to be in a BBC drama. And that to me was just so frustrating because that was not what he was written as, you know. And so I guess I'd say probably the thing I would most kind of advocate for is research the actual real diversity of the time period and not just kind of our notion of it, but also don't fall into this error of thinking of people outside of their context, outside of their community. So because only just thinking about like your Black character in relation to the white characters around them is very limiting to that Black character, and it means that their whole life is kind of centered around the caprices of these white people. And that kind of, for all, like, even if you have the best characterization in the world, is going to limit that character, you know? And I think that's what ended up happening to Susanna Clarke, and I love that novel, you know?
Oh, great observations. Thank you so much. We have a bunch more questions. I hope you're up for it. We'll try not to wear you out. Because a lot of people don't know the book. I just pasted the synopsis into the chat field so people could get sort of a general feel. Okay. But awesome. Letha wanted to know, what is your main character Phyllis's skill with her hands? What does she do with them, and what does she do?
Okay, so she was born, well, more accurately, the hands come down with a dream. So when you're 10 years old, you kind of have an uncanny dream. And in the Black community, this is true, you know, there's a huge kind of cultural obsession with a gambling game called the numbers. And so everybody would write like 3 numbers on a slip of paper, and they would give it to numbers runners, and the numbers runners would go to the bank, and then they would compare the 3 numbers to the last 3 numbers of the mutuels, which was a kind of like a horse racing, basically like for horse racers, they would like print the results of the horse races, and then they had some kind of aggregate number. I am not sure exactly what on earth this number was for. No one cared in Harlem because that number was only useful because it was a randomly generated number, and they would use the last 3 digits of this long number, and then that would be what they used to calculate what the winning numbers were. And so people would play for pennies, and this ran through, especially it was huge in Harlem. And so basically when the dream comes down, people are you know, they say, oh, you know, let's go find, you know, the kid of you know, Mrs. Lee over there, because we got to figure out what our numbers are because they have a lucky dream. But what you also get is some kind of power. And so in Phyllis's case, she had uncanny aim. You know, she's just very good at aiming things. And of course, what she uses that for is to throw knives and kill people. You know, so it wasn't exactly that she's gifted at murder. You know, she made that choice because it gave her a lot of kind of local power. And so that's kind of part of the reason why I'm talking about a lot of these issues of power and violence, because even though, you know, in general, the white power structure is kind of overpressed, like very overpowering, she herself and these people like her have a little extra, you know, and because the only people with the hands are marginalized people of color. And so it's a little extra to help them maybe get ahead in a certain local way, but it has its own consequences, as Phyllis's story shows.
That's interesting. I've never hered of this tradition of being gifted that way in terms of number running. I always thought it was betting.
Well, I mean, the betting, I would say I linked in my own story the kind of tradition of absolutely this, like the number running, and then the hands, which is based on Conroy. It does have those elements to it, which are kind of more traditional, absolutely very real African-American folk traditions. But the actual, when people get the dreams, they have to, I mean, but there were, not my own version of things, but I mean, in actual historical fact, there were actual books people published, Aunt Sally's Dream Book. And they were entire books of, if you dream about socks, that means that you should pick 7, and things like, and whole lists of things that you could dream about, and then what number that corresponds to. And people would pore over these in order to select their number. So I didn't have to go very far afield, to be frank, with my magical insertion. I mean, it was almost as if, it was already there when I went in, and really dug into the historical documents.
That's fantastic. We have a question here from Margaret. She wanted to know, how does an author gauge where to leave off in issues of moral judgment? For example, the issue of passing for personal gain. And how do you illustrate authentic emotional struggles amidst a very complicated moral landscape of choices without coming across as pedantic?
That's really interesting. I'd say that what I most tried to do was, if there was judgment happening in the book, the judgment was coming from the characters in a way that I tried to make as psychologically realistic as possible. I also made them as three-dimensional as possible. I think that you can sympathize with all of their choices, even though I think the main characters are Phyllis, her ex-lover Dev, and her best friend Tamara. And I think all 3 of those characters make choices that you could, as a reader, say, these are not great choices. They're just not. But I think you also can sympathize and understand why they made those choices. And that's kind of where I try to come down. I think it doesn't come off as pedantic as long as you were living the emotional reality of your characters, as long as you're giving them, you understand, just for example, right? Like, you understand why it would be that Phyllis, with her light skin and her ability to pass, might have made the choice to do so. Well, even though what she decided to do was not the best, I
don't know if I'm still on mic. Am I still on mic?
But
that passage where she's in the hospital,
mm-hmm.
It's the White Hospital, and they wouldn't have taken her. And then the other scene where she's trying to get in the hospital and somebody knows she's passing and they won't take her, and she's miscarrying or whatever that one is. Just horrifying. And of course you're gonna, to save your life. That was,
Right. And that, but it's, no, you're not to like too many spoilers, but her choice to do that, even in the hospital, is one that Tamara, who cannot pass, right, is not exactly judging her, but is definitely very aware of this choice. It's not neutral to her, and so I'm not passing judgment on Tamara. I'm not passing judgment on P, but I'm also marking that it's not neutral. The fact that she's able to buy into a system of violence in order to get better treatment, even in situations of life or death. Because what does that imply? That implies that someone like Tamara would just die,
Right. And that, for, as I say, some people looking like me, I was aware of, black hospitals, white hospitals, but that particular thing where if you could pass, you could get into the white hospital, had not been in my consciousness.
Right.
That was a great truth that came to me reading your story.
And here's a good question from Adrian. She wants to know what you think of Lillian Smith's novels and her treatment of race issues in the mid-20th century. Did her work inspire you in any way?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with those novels.
Okay. So we got lots more questions. So here we go.
I should look those up.
No worries. This is not a test for you. This is. So Lauren Conrad wanted to know, how does someone write literary fiction and multiple genres of fiction and get all these awards? I mean, you've written short stories, you've published in magazines. I mean, how did you branch out in so many different ways of writing?
I think that really science fiction and fantasy is a deeply deep. It is a deep and forgiving genre. It really allows for so many different expressions. Some of the best literary writers I know are working in science fiction and fantasy. And to be frank, a lot of what we think of as literary, straight literary fiction could easily be considered science fiction and fantasy. It really, a lot of that depends so much on marketing. Someone like David Mitchell, I love David Mitchell, but I mean, when you look at a lot of his work, it's science fiction and fantasy. I think he'd be the first to admit it, because when you read his work, he is clearly very aware of a lot of like the antecedents in the genre of what he's writing, So in terms of, the breadth of what I work on, part of it is I just am not happy unless I'm doing something new and different and challenging to myself. And so I don't tend to go back to the same well once I feel like I've done it in a way that I'm satisfied with. I mean, I don't know about, in the future, but certainly for now, I've just always been looking to experiment and explore and do new things, just how I end up, starting a band and getting a master's degree and writing science fiction and fantasy and I would say the choice to write kind of more explicitly literary style. I've always been really enamored with language, but I will say that I kind of branched out and I started reading a lot more science fiction, but science fiction from kind of different subgenres. People. I'd been exposed to Ursula Le Guin early in my life, but, coming back to her as a slightly older woman was an amazing revelation, because she's just a brilliant wordsmith, everything on top of everything else, and there's so many amazing writers in this field. And so just to be able to understand that I could very much continue to write what I want to write, which is science fiction, fantasy, or speculative fiction, but also play with language and play with tropes and have interesting experiments with structure and things like that. So that was how I ended up just throwing it all out there, because I realized I could, no one's going to stop me. So that's what I've been doing.
Speaking of that, Mort wants to know if you write stories in Spanish as well.
I think that fiction in your second language is the I don't know, like Nabokov could do it, but I'm not exactly on that level. I wish. I've tried writing a few stories. They're very hard. It's just extremely, extremely hard. I speak Spanish very well, but not quite that well. And I think, frankly, in order for me to do it, I'd almost have to stop writing in English. Like I'd have to spend a year breaking myself of my thinking in English habit, which I have maintained just because, I write in English and I'm a writer in English. And at the end of the day, that's what I do. But that does kind of, I think, put a hard stop on my ability to kind of cross that last threshold of being able to produce in a creative way in Spanish. Like I can write academic texts and that's not a problem, but I'd have to stop. And I don't, maybe one day I will, maybe one day it will seem like an interesting experiment, but for now I still quite like writing in English. So I have no plans of stopping doing that.
Well, and it's a good follow-up question. This comes from Fanula. She says, I love the point on languages and how being bilingual makes you view English differently. What is your view on including non-English words and phrases in books written in English, but set in non-English speaking locations? Does it give fiction a foreign flavor?
That's an interesting question. I think it really depends on what you're working on the necessities of that particular story. There's people who will include foreign words in a way that just feels like they're just like tossing in potpourri, and I think that is not useful. It does kind of like put this weird patina of like, oh, here in the foreign lands. I don't think that really is that great. But on the other hand, just for example, I mean, this is not historical fiction, but although it does have elements of historical fiction, but what is it called? Oh my gosh, Oscar Wow. What is the full title of Oscar Wow? Of oh my gosh, I don't know how I can't remember this, but okay. Thank you, person in the comments to brief it on this, like Oscar Wow. By Junot Diaz. So that book has a lot of Spanish in it, and it's just mixed in. It works very well because it's clearly part of the way the characters themselves are thinking, and it's used to delineate concepts, and mostly concepts and things that really don't have a solid English equivalent, or to use an English equivalent, you're implying something that you shouldn't be implying. It kind of sometimes, especially in these contexts where the English language has a kind of imperialist sheen over what the language of the people who you were talking about is, you end up by using the choosing to use the English word for that, you can sometimes be implying a kind of cultural superiority that I don't think is a good idea to imply. And so in that context, I think, yes, I mean, use the words in the other language that makes sense. I like to think of it in the way that if you read a fantasy novel, and a fantasy novel has, people have, they say, I picked up my googly-doo, when you turn and you read a few pages and you realize the googly-doo is actually just a fork. You say, why didn't you just use the word fork? Like, it's not that useful. But there are other fantasy novels that have different words for concepts that are very particular to that world, in that society, and so they'll use that term. And of course, these are made up societies, so it's a little different, but I like that as an analogy just because it can make it a little clearer to you when it's useful to use the term from that language, and when it's just you kind of smearing your fingers over something, saying like, oh, look, and I understand the temptation, especially if you're doing a lot of research in that time period, in that language, it can feel natural to use a lot of those words. But I do think you kind of have to step back a little and try to navigate it. And it is very complicated. I'm sure there's absolutely no one right way of doing things, but those are the kind of pitfalls I would be aware of.
Right. And here's another question from Margaret. Do you feel freer during events to have opinions and advocate than you did when constructing the story because of maintaining that distance from judgment?
I don't know that it's exactly one or the other. It's how did I say? The act of telling the story, as Selena so beautifully put it at the beginning, is itself an act of activism. It's a statement. I'm just by doing that, by telling a story of a woman passing, by telling a story so rooted in structures of patriarchal and imperialist violence in the States. It seems to me that itself is more than enough, right? So that I'm not there to judge these characters because they're living it. They're navigating it. In the same way that it's hard for me to say judge my parents for a lot of the choices that they made while navigating a lot of these really complicated issues. And I think that from to say like I refrain from judgment isn't exactly true, because in a lot of ways I'm making judgments by what I choose to put in the story. I'm making judgments by how I'm choosing to tell this story. So there's no need to be getting on a soapbox, because I'm already deciding how I need to tell a story that's different from the kinds of stories that I've been able to tell, or that other people have been able to tell before, or that haven't gotten the kind of amplification before. That's kind of how I see it. So that when I sound maybe more kind of strident in an event where I'm talking about it in a kind of more meta way, to me it's not very different. It's just they're two different modes. One is more or less what we'll call it nonfiction, and the other one is fiction.
Well, here's a question from Cynthia. She wants to know, what are the kinds of things that you worry about as a historical fiction author?
Ooh. I worry a lot about imposing my own view of things on people whose assumptions and baseline kind of biases were so different from mine. I worry about not so much like being ahistorical, like their language, but their way of thinking. That's kind of the thing that I'm most worried about. And that's a tough one, right? I mean, especially kind of the further back you go, it can be tricky to decide or make that judgment of how do people see the world. And it's tricky. I mean, sometimes I think it's even trickier than people realize, because you end up with a lot of revisionism that you think of as historical reality, like our notion of the Regency period being lily white. I mean, that's totally not true. It's completely fabricated. But going against that, you're like, oh, am I imposing my own modern views of diversity on the past? But in fact, it's not. That's not true. That's not in fact what you're doing. And I think sometimes I really have to kind of stop myself also from trying to make people in the past when I'm writing historical fiction. I actually have a short story collection coming out in November, and I have a story that takes place during the Civil War from the perspective of a Black laundress for one of the very first Black divisions in the Civil War. And she travels with her division throughout the whole war in the South Carolina Sea Islands. And so it's all from her perspective. And I had a lot of struggles in that story, because I really wanted to show her perspective, and I did not want it to just say, this is my perspective as like a modern Black woman. But I also didn't want to how would I say this? I didn't want to make her kind of too simple, or her attitude was just so obviously, historical, because a lot of what we think of as historical isn't accurate, and a lot of what we think of as modern actually has its origins in the deep past. And so that was a lot of what I was really working with, where you don't want someone to just sound like she could be talking right now, but on the other hand, a lot of what we're struggling with are not new issues, or just not. They're things that great thinkers have been dealing with for centuries or millennia. And certainly by the time, the Civil War ended, a great deal of what we were still struggling with was absolutely on the page. Like, people were talking about it and thinking about it, so that to me is, it's a really tricky line to walk, but I try, but that's definitely what I'm always worrying about. I mean, more than anything else, more than clothes or food or whatever, that's what I'm mostly worrying about.
Well, Faith wants to know if you've read Kindred by Octavia Butler, and if so, did she inspire you in any way in your writing or your career?
Yes. Okay. So Kindred is my touchstone novel. I adore this novel. I read it for the first time in 8th grade, which is a remarkably precious age to be reading. I mean, it is a hard novel, but it's great. And she actually, that's such a wonderful question, just to segue from what I was just talking about, because Octavia Butler was brilliant at that. I mean, because the premise of Kindred, right, is that this modern Black woman travels back in time to a plantation of her ancestors, and kind of has to keep saving her white ancestor, who was the plantation owner for her Black ancestor, but she actually doesn't, she kind of meets this woman who's his slave. And she has to kind of keep this boy alive so that she can continue to exist. And it's a brilliant grandfather paradox story. And it's really interesting because, she's a modern woman, but she talks to all of, she's there as a slave in this plantation. And so she's talking with all the other slaves, and a lot of what she does is break you out of this kind of complacent notion you have of what history is like and what people were willing to think of and what kind of attitudes they had. She really takes it out of this kind of laminate of the past and makes it very, very present, and makes it very clear the extent to which a lot of those issues continue to be very, they haven't changed that much, and the way of people thinking about them hasn't changed as much as we wish it had.
Yeah. Well, here's a question from Lauren. How do you feel about white people writing a protagonist as a person of color? Does it feel like we need more of those stories? But on the other hand, do those books tend to feel less nuanced about racism?
I think it just depends on well, let me put it like this. If you, I'm not here to say, that anyone shouldn't write a story with a protagonist of color, but I will say that as some, if you are not from that particular background, especially if you're a white person writing someone, just because of the power dynamics inherent in that, it really is incumbent upon you to do a lot of research and to get a lot of people, readers who can help you with that, who do have kind of more background or more experience, who have lived that in some way, what they call sensitivity readers. I mean, people, you can absolutely, pay people for their time, for their expertise in what they've lived in their lives, in historical realities and all sorts of things, and I think it's really important. It's important for all of us to do that, but I think it's really important for writers to do that, because otherwise it is very easy to settle into a notion of, I'm including this because I think, it's important, but I don't quite understand why or what it's doing, and so you end up with what I was describing with the Susanna Clarke novel, where this character kind of exists as this object upon which all of these other white characters can have opinions and act, and show different attitudes of the time. And it's just sort of like a little museum exhibit almost. And it just doesn't feel real. And it feels kind of exploitative. And again, it's ironic that I bring up Susanna Clarke in this, because I actually think that she wrote Stephen very well. I actually really enjoyed her portrayal of him, and it does not feel in the novel as a kind of museum exhibit, but as I said, that kind of fatal flaw of not putting him in enough context with his own people really, in the end, kind of hampered that novel, and it made the adaptation just really disappointing on that level, And so I think that just saying, I'm going to write it and it's not going to be overtly racist, that's that's just the floor, You got to build a house, and to build the house, you need more expertise. You need to really figure out what it is this character, why they're there, what world they're living in, what their relationship is. It might really fundamentally change the story that you thought you were telling when you really dig into it. And I think that's important, because otherwise it's really easy to just fall into the same kinds of old stories.
That's so important. Thank you so much, because I think we're all struggling with what is authentic, and how can we relate. I'm going to be greedy and ask a question. The use of the playing cards by your oracle in it, is that part of your tradition in terms of telling futures and divination? Is that something that's inherent to your background?
No, that's part of what I imagined in the kind of fantasy side of the novel. Certainly, so to clarify those who have not read the novel, Tamara, Phyllis's best friend, is an oracle. She was trained by her great aunt with a deck of old playing cards, or just regular playing cards. But she kind of reads fortunes and the numbers and kind of connects to the ancestors in that way. And so her mode of reading the cards and all that's part of the kind of fantasy system of the novel. But I will say that in terms of the Black community conjure, especially numbers running, I mean, people absolutely, as I said with those dream books, they absolutely used all sorts of divinatory systems in order to try to get their numbers. And so using playing cards as kind of divinatory system for getting their numbers was something that did happen. It wasn't exactly a system in the way that I'm describing it in the novel. Also, people use tarot cards, people used jacks, people use all sorts of things. So so that's the kind of, so I certainly was riffing on something so that it felt more kind of real and realistic to me, but no, it wasn't kind of a direct analog of anything in my own tradition.
I bought it because I know tarot cards, and I kept going back, 7. She's using 7. Let's go back and look at 7 of Cups. You were right on a lot of them. So I was like, oh, she must really.
Awesome.
I have one more question here. What is it like to launch a book during a pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a new one for me, and I'm sure all of you. I'm like, I guess I just kind of said, well, it's funny because it is my first novel in 6 years. And so it was just sort of like this big event, and I'm going to go back to the States, and I'm going to be in New York for the first time, and I'm going to, because I have, I've visited New York a couple of times, and I haven't been able to spend kind of longer stretches there. And so I was like, this time I'm going to spend a month there. And I'm, so I had all these plans, and my publisher was going to send me out, and I was going to do a tour. And now we're all on Zoom. So I don't know. It's all new. There's all sorts of, even though it's kind of horrible, and there's a lot of really, frustrating and difficult things happening, I feel like also it's kind of amazing being able to share the novel with writers who I would not otherwise have been able to come together with, or readers who couldn't afford to travel or get out, or so I feel like in some ways it's interesting because we're just all now exploring this whole new way of doing things. And so that to me is kind of amazing. Like it's not what I thought, but it's also not horrible,
We have one last question. What do you enjoy from Letha? What do you enjoy about living in Mexico as opposed to living in the United States or New York City?
So I love New York. Like I love New York City, but it's a hard city to live in. It was very expensive. It gets more expensive. So it's one of those things where as a writer who was attempting to manage it as a full-time job, it kind of became untenable. And Mexico it's a country that I've had this kind of long-standing love affair with, just reading about it, researching. This history of Mexico is amazing. And I got a kind of small grant to come down here like a decade ago, and I came for 2 weeks. I said, I just have to come back, so every time I came to Mexico, I said I have to come back. And so 6 years ago I said, what if I just go to Mexico? I mean, I could just go to Mexico. It was just one of those moments where you maybe like pee, right? You just decide you could just make different choices, and you just, well, what if I did that? And that to me just opened up everything in my life. I feel that I made this incredibly difficult choice that opened up so many avenues. I love living in Spanish. I love the food. I love the people. I don't know. If you ever just kind of go to a place and you just totally connect, you just feel like this is where you should be. That's what Mexico's been like for me. I just realized, here I could kind of take a deep breath and relax. And it's been like that for the last 6 years. So,
well, we have a link for your book in the chat, but I'd like to ask you, what are your next projects coming up?
So as I mentioned, I have a short story collection, which has 2 new short stories and older short stories called Reconstruction, coming out from Small Beer Press in November. So that Civil War story that I was telling you guys about, that is the title story from the collection, which is a new story. And it's a doozy. Took me almost as long to write as it would take someone else to write a novel, but I'm really pleased with how it came out. And it's very much historical fiction. And I have a YA novel I'm working on, which should come out next year, but things are fluid and life is strange. And so, stay tuned.
Well, we'd really like to encourage everybody to buy the book. The link to Amazon is right in the chat. Christina and I were fortunate enough to get to read a preview, because when was it published? It was just published this week, wasn't it?
It was published a week ago. So like last Tuesday.
Well, it's a fabulous read. I highly recommend it. I couldn't put it down. And, we are so lucky to have you and to talk to us about what you're going through.
And that concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society and our leadership at our website, or contact us at hns-nyc@mail.com. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites below. Thanks for joining us.